Welcome back to the New Levels Coaching Podcast. Remember, we are the coaching podcast that brings you lots of inspiration and education so that you can literally go away and run with that. As always, I am your host, Lewis Moses, founder here at NLC. And this week, I'm delighted to be joined virtually by our coach, Aaron Scott. Aaron is one of the NLC coaches here at New Levels Coaching. He's also a fantastic athlete. He still is an athlete. Many people might not have seen him on the roads for a while, but I still see his name popping up on entry lists every now and again, and I know we'll see him back on the road. But he's a very busy man. He is a father to two young children, one recently born. He also hosts his own podcast, although that's taken a little bit of backseat while life has got a little bit busier. So if you've not checked that out already, then certainly, I'll put it in the show notes and you can go and check that podcast out because there is hundreds of episodes on there and lots of great content. But Aaron is a brilliant coach. He boasts PBs of the 2:16 for the marathon. And he brings that marathon knowledge to his coaching, and let's just say he applies it very, very well. But he also has PBs down at 5K, close to 14 minutes. Never quite went under that 14-minute barrier, but very, very close to 30 minutes and 65 minutes for a half, which is unbelievable range from 5K all the way upwards. And I could go down further. He started as a track athlete and progressed to the marathon. And as I say, now really focuses on the coaching as well as still keeping himself fit and well. So Aaron, welcome to the podcast. I should have said as well, he is an Ipswich Town fan and they were promoted this year. I'm a Leeds United fan, so Aaron and I had a few little battles over the course of the season, but Ipswich came out on top and back to the Premier League. But welcome, Aaron, first time on the pod. How are you?
Yeah, thanks, mate. No, good to be here. It's nice to be on the other side, like listening to you reel off as a host. I've been in that position many a time, and it's not the easiest of jobs to remember everything you've got to say. But just on my PBs, I still think actually the one you didn't mention is my favourite, the 1500 around 3:53. And for anybody who knows me, knows I have relatively zero speed, and I don't think I've ever broken 60 seconds for 400 in training, and I closed I think in a 61. So. I don't think my legs have moved faster than that night. So good to be here. And as you said, Ipswich getting promoted was an added bonus this year. So I'm feeling positive for the new season.
Well, I always kick off by asking our guests to give us a life or coaching positive. I assume that's a pretty big one, Ipswich being back in the glory land of the Premier League. But any other coaching or life positives you want to throw in there, Aaron?
Well, as you said, my son Bobby was born. I think it's 11 weeks ago. So, you'll know better. It was playoff final, first leg night. Leeds played Norwich. So I was in a massive dilemma because if Leeds would have picked Ipswich, we would have played Norwich in the playoffs, and that night would have been torture. Probably more so for my wife doesn't care about football, but she had to go through the labour. I just had to watch, but yeah, that would be a pretty eventful night. So I'd have to say, obviously the birth of my son would probably be the life positive, but I'd be lying if I didn't mention Ipswich. I've been a fan since as long as I can remember, and to be back in the Premier League after 20 odd years is a special day. And Bobby is actually semi-named after Bobby Robson, so
nice,
big Ipswich icon.
Ipswich legend. Well, congratulations to Ipswich, and all too familiar with playoff semi-final legs. I spent the last playoff semi-final leg, Leeds versus Derby, that was the one previously, in hospital, funnily enough, seeing as you mentioned that. I had a bit of a heart condition going on, and when I went into A&E that day, they said, any reason why this might have been triggered? And I said, Leeds are playing Derby today, so it could be that. But we won't go down the route of comparing labour that your wife was potentially going to be on that day to football. That will not go down too well. But you mentioned those track PBs, and I mentioned some of those road PBs you have. I have a question for you to kick us off, Aaron. Were they all done before super shoes? Are any of your PBs in carbon shoes?
The marathon is. I wore the first, so the Vaporfly 4%, the Flyknit one, the orange one. So that was what I wore for my 2 quickest marathons. The next year I wore the next percent, the green one. So the two fastest marathons I've ran were in super shoes, but I did run 30-40 seconds slower at London 2:17 mid in a pair of Saucony Fast Twitch. So that's probably a slightly better performance, although I think that day we went out in 67 flat, so that was a long, painful road.
Oh.
Especially in those old flats. My legs, I literally couldn't walk after the finish line. So yeah, the rest of them are pre-super shoes. All the track stuff was probably in a pair of Matumbos or Victories or something like that.
I went on the track the other night in a pair of Victories, believe it or not. I was pacing one of the athletes I coach, and one of the coaches came over and was like laughing, and he was like, "Oh, I recognise them." And then the younger athletes were like, "What the heck are they?" And yeah, it's amazing how much shoes and spikes have changed over the last few years.
Do you remember when we used to do sessions in like a Victory or Matumbo, and
Yeah,
stick your jogging shoes back on, and they'd feel so cushioned. And I always remember that difference. You'd go onto the track and you do your strides and your spikes, and they feel so fast because that was the lightest, fastest thing around. And I did the same. I tried a 5K a few years ago in a pair of old Matumbos, having not worn anything but super shoes for about 3-4 years for sessions, and they felt like I felt like I was in bare feet, like the worst thing I've ever worn. So it's amazing how used to the super shoes and cushioning you get. Yeah,
yeah.
I'd quite like if to see everybody line up in an old school pair of like racing flats for a marathon and just see what happens.
Well, I think there's a couple of things, and I'm sure we'll go on to it when it comes to marathon training. But the fact that we became so conditioned to those shoes and now we're so deconditioned to them, right? It probably shows that you do develop that strength for the footwear you're in, and maybe that shoe technology is deconditioning us a little bit, and that calf strength, foot strength, because I came away from that track session, my Achilles were in pieces, and I never really used to have Achilles problems, but it was very noticeable. So yeah, I think we'd see a lot of damage done now if people were to go back in flats for a marathon after training in super shoes for so long.
Yeah, my legs were. I mean, obviously I was doing a lot more mileage. I was definitely stronger back then. I used to do quite a lot of sessions in just a pair of spikes and have no issues. And you're right. These days, if I go into anything like that, my feet are sore and everything. I mean, I'm a massive advocate for super shoes. I think they're fantastic. But nothing against them. It's just nice being able to wear both, and we can compare and talk about it. And I think it's great for the sport that we've now finally got some footwear that allows us to not be as beat up as we used to be. It's pretty ridiculous that we sort of had to. Well, I remember racing some hilly, like 30K type races in a pair of racing flats and not being able to really walk properly for a couple of days. And now you don't get that. So at least we can train in something that's a bit nicer for us.
Yeah, like I say, we'll get onto it in training, but I speak to a lot of the older generation, and you hear it a lot, don't you? They say, "Oh, well, we didn't have all this technology back in the day," and I'm like, "Yeah, but you've got blown out knees and hips, and like you're struggling to walk, or you're going in for knee operations." So I'm 100% with you. If we can make that or running a little bit safer and a little bit kinder on our bodies, then why not? And if we're getting faster results as a result of that, then great. I'm going to backtrack to long before carbon days, though. And well, God knows what shoes and spikes were like when we both started. We are of a similar age. We're now Masters 35, both of us in the V35 category. But what got you into running, Aaron, originally? Was it running from the start, or was it cross sports? Did you get into running from another sport? Where did the journey start for you?
So for me, it was always football. And the first cross-country race I did, well, the first probably 3 or 4 cross-country races I did were in football boots. Probably a pair of Adidas World Cups or something like that. But I played football until I was well, I played football into uni, but sixth form competitively, and I first did a cross country race in year 11. Like, so I was always active as a kid. Like, I played football every day, every evening we were playing football. So I was a midfielder. I played on the wing. I was pretty fit. I could get up and down. So my friend who I walked to school with said, "Oh, we've got cross country today, and if you come do it, you can get out of maths." And I was like, "Perfect, I'll come do cross country." So we did the properly Anglian schools qualifier in Ipswich, and I think I did okay that first year. I probably even qualified for the next round, which was always on a Saturday, but I could never do the Saturday next round because it was always sort of, I want to say about 10, 11 o'clock, and I was always playing junior football because we played Saturday mornings. So last year of sixth form, I made it through to the Anglians. No, the one before the Anglian. I think the Ipswich region, which was a Saturday, and I was playing senior football, and we kicked off at 2:30. So I went and ran that in the morning and played 90 minutes of football in the afternoon, and I managed that year to get to the Anglian schools, and I qualified for English schools. So my last year of sixth form, I probably got into running a little bit more, and I think I placed, I don't know if you were in the race, Lewis, about 130th, which
Oh,
I look at the results now and again, and there was Johnny Mellor was in the 20s. My good training friend Ian Kimpton was actually in 2 places ahead of me, I think,
wow.
and Matt Gumby, who I ran with in later years, was also around me. So it's always funny now and again looking back, because I think it was the year Dan Watts won, and his brother Glenn still runs a little bit around this way, so I see him now and again, and we had a lad from Ipswich, Kelvin Hardy, who placed pretty highly. So
I remember Calvin. Yeah, Calvin was
yeah,
good.
it was probably the last year of sixth form. So when I was 17, turning 18, that I got into running a little bit. And basically, long story short, like, I didn't make it playing football. I wasn't good enough. I was probably a little bit better at running, so I thought I'll give this a go. And my dad's cousin is a guy called David Miller. So on the Suffolk road running scene, he was the big dog, and I think he won over 200 races, and he wasn't lightning fast compared to these days, but on a local scene, he was the big fish. And I always saw his results because my nana would tell me about his results, and I thought, these guys running 10k, they can't be that fast. Like, I'm doing all right English schools. So I think that summer after that cross country, I rocked up to Framlingham 10k, which is a little local 10k. It's famous now because Ed Sheeran lives in Framlingham, and it's from Framlingham. And I was wearing a pair of Adidas martial arts shoes, which were like these flat little fashion trainer type things. And I went off with the leaders, and I think I stopped 5 times in that race. So I think I ran 41:30ish on my 10k debut back then.
Wow.
So yeah, that's where it started. I then joined. I took a gap year from school and went travelling in that sort of second half of that year, and worked at Sweatshop in Ipswich before that. So got a little bit more into running, joined the local running club, Woodbridge Shufflers, and my introduction into running was really long distance stuff. I did, well, just before I finished school, I did the man versus horse in Wales.
Oh yeah, we were talking about that this weekend. Actually, we were down in
Oh, really?
Wales and somebody mentioned it. It's like,
Yeah,
wow.
my school teacher was an ultra runner, and he convinced me and my mate that we should do this event. So my mate was also a footballer. We did about 2 training runs together. He gave up on it, and I turned up at this man versus horse. Drove up the morning of the race. My dad drove me up, and it's an early start, and I'm stood there in like a I think I was in a Suffolk Schools jumper. It's not knowing, and I was in a pair of like I think Adidas Supernova road shoes, my first running shoe. There's bogs, there's hills. It was painful, but yeah, that was my introduction into running, really.
Oh, I love it. I think what it says to our listeners is we all start somewhere, and they might look at, you now and think, oh God, Aaron, this amazing runner, amazing coach, knows everything, but we don't know what we don't know. And when we start out, everybody's in the same boat. We're all beginners at some point. I think people forget that. And that they're 2 really good examples there, like rocking up in a pair of martial arts shoes for a road race and then rocking up in a pair of road shoes for an ultra. And was it blue, the Suffolk jumper?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember it. Yeah, Kelvin was it. Blue and white. Kelvin was a good runner. So where was that first cross country that you did? Which one was that?
It was at Norwich.
Norwich Showground, of course. Yeah.
So that one little hill I remember, but yeah, it was a baptism of fire, I think, going into those races that I did, and then I think I then started running some half marathons, and I started going up to Ipswich Harriers. We won't go into that too much because it's a bit controversial. But yeah, then I just started running with the likes of Kelvin and a few others, and just slowly got a little bit quicker and quicker. But my family are not runners. We're all football. My mum did a little bit of cross country at school, but she knows zero about running. So very, very naive back in the day. And I used to go out on jogs with my brother, and it was literally a case of I hate to think how slow we were going, but then we'd just have an all-out sprint for the last 400 to see who would get back to the house first. But yeah,
this is brilliant. This is brilliant. It shows, like you say, we all start somewhere and we all make those mistakes. And now you'd think you wouldn't teach that to anybody, but it's good fun, and it's what you do when you first get into it, isn't it? It's interesting though, the crossover, because I came from a football background. A lot of people who get into sport, particularly running, come from different backgrounds, but football seems like a really popular one. There is obviously a lot of crossover skills there, but England athletics teach it on the coaching qualification and through their education pathways that it's not about early specialism. It's better to be almost trialing different sports, developing those skills, those cross skills, and then becoming a little bit better at your craft as you get older. We don't see that in Kenya, of course, because they just run the entire time. But we do have people, you've quite rightly pointed out here, you could name probably the top 10 at that English schools, of which a lot of them didn't even make it to senior level. And a lot of the ones who develop later do go and make it. So Josh Kerr's a perfect example from the Olympics. He wasn't the best junior. He did start to get a little bit better. But we see loads of examples of it, don't we, where people start to specialise a bit later.
Yeah, exactly. I think even maybe one of the Brownlees was in that race as well, and he was, I think, outside the top 10 as well. And I think for me, and yeah, looking at the likes of Kelvin, who we've spoke about, who didn't run past that year really, they go to university, probably in an athletics type environment as well at university, and then they find girls and alcohol and other distractions, and girls find the boys, etc. And I think they're just a bit burnt out by it, a lot of them, and they need a new outlet. Whereas I never had running, so once I got a bit more serious about it in my early 20s, it was something to focus on because I'd not focused on it. I'd always been playing team sports, and it's just a very different environment. And yeah, I think my longevity in running is probably because I didn't do it at such a young age in this country. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what the kind of the research points to, doesn't it? It's like your chronological age is a lot different to the developmental age within the sport, and you've got a lot more years, and you've not got that beating. And as we spoke about before with the shoes, like you've not got that batter in the legs, you've not been overtrained, you're quite fresh. I always compare it to like the age of a child. Like when you got in your 20s, you're technically still in nappies because you're only 2 or 3 years into the sport at that point, and
Yeah.
you're probably making huge jumps as well, which is really positive because you're just seeing PB after PB after PB. Did you know quite quickly, Aaron, that you were going to go to the marathon? You mentioned you almost started at longer distances, which is unusual, isn't it? It's like
Yeah.
usually people start at the shorter distances. You've come at it a different way there.
Yeah. I mean, endurance was always my strong point. And when I went to university at Lincoln, I went up to the athletics club probably, I'd say straight away. I had a pretty intense freshers month where I didn't do much running, and then joined up with the club. And I suppose I was quite lucky in that when I joined, some of the sort of 15, 16-year-old lads coming through who had just started running as well, um, they were a bit quicker, and they're all still, they're my good friends now. They're all still running, so we had a great group that have carried on. But yeah, I'd always have the endurance on them. So when we hit an endurance session, I would always be out in front. So that's what I always enjoyed, and I kept up with some of the longest stuff for quite a while, probably until I think it was even my last year of uni, or when I finished uni, that my coach Mark Badley thought, we'll try and get you to run a 1500 and a few 3Ks and see if we can develop a little bit of speed but to help you. And it worked, but I was never going to run the sort of times that, if you compare, say, my 5 or my 10K time, the other guys running those were running like 3:45 or low
Yeah.
3:40s, like probably you were doing. And I just didn't have that in my legs. So yeah, sort of speed was a means to an end for me. It was kind of try and get as much out of me as I can to help me when I move up to the ultimately the marathon. And I was going to go to the marathon very, very early. Like, I actually entered London Marathon when I was 17, 18, and
Wow.
didn't get in. So I always thought about it. And then probably, early 2010s, we didn't have a lot of people moving to the marathon very early. So I think when I moved in 2013, what I'd been 26, 25, 26, that was young
Yeah.
then. And I think in the last few years, we've seen people move a lot earlier. So yeah, it was always going to end up there. And I'm glad it did, because it's what I enjoy more than anything is the longer stuff. Those I ran 1/800 in my life, and it's the most painful thing. And I still say to people, the most painful session I ever did. So there's a guy in Peterborough called Paul Larkins. I presume you know his name.
Yeah.
What he ran 3:34 for 1500, maybe 3:35. He used to coach like a middle distance group, and I jumped in with them one night, and they had 2 lots of 400s. So the
Oh,
400s were off a minute, but then you had maybe 10, 15 minutes between sets,
yeah.
and they were flat out. And I've never experienced pain like that. So yeah, short stuff's not for me.
No, it's deceiving, isn't it? And when you tell people they're going to run like anaerobically like that as hard as they can, and then I just have a minute and then repeat it again 15 minutes later, it doesn't sound too bad at first, but when you actually do it, it's absolutely horrific. I'm going to ask you to put your coach's hat on here though, because I think there's a really interesting point you make about developing that speed. So your coach, Mark, at the time, I think you said he suggested going and improving your speed, even at that point, thinking long term for the marathon. So why might people need to think about that? Because the marathon's this aerobic event. They spend a lot of time out there on the road. But at this point in time, your coach is saying to you, well, let's develop your speed first before you go to that, which I think is great coaching.
Yeah.
But enlighten our audience around that decision.
Well, I suppose simplistically, right? if you're quicker at, let's just say 5K for now. If you're quicker at 5K, then you're going to be quicker at 10, and you're going to be quicker at the half, and ultimately the marathon. So it sort of, cascades down. But I suppose what you're doing is you're building that range, aren't you? So your VO2, let's say for me, when I was running 5K, I got down to, what was it, 4:32 for a mile. So I was doing some of those VO2 sessions around, let's say 4:40, 4:45 per mile. So therefore my threshold is slightly, well, you've got to do the work around threshold, but your threshold's slightly quicker. So say at sort of 5:05 per mile. And then your marathon pace is quicker. Like, for me, it was sort of 5:10, 5:15, but you've got then that range of 5:15 for marathon pace, but sort of 4:40 for your VO2. So you've got like a 30, sometimes bigger 30, 45 second type range. And if you don't have that, and you're sort of, let's say you're running 7-minute mile for a marathon, but your 5K isn't much quicker, you just don't have that sort of range, and it makes that, that threshold running quite hard, feel quite hard, or and then when you try and go do a 5K and you can't go any quicker, and it just doesn't give you much place to go, does it, with your training paces? So it's all about building out that, I'm doing this with my hands, building out that range, lengthening that range of paces, so you've got a wider range. And if you look at the likes of Mo Farah or Emil Caress more recently, they've got that range, so ultimately when they come to a marathon they can go much, much quicker.
I'm going to use Charlie Purdue as an example here. Unfortunately, she's just pulled out of the Olympics, which is a huge shame. But I remember chatting to her in a training camp once about this, and she was under a coach at the time, and she was saying she didn't have that range, and then she went to Nick Bedot and she started to develop it a bit more, and then she had huge success over the marathon later on in life. And I do think it was testament to developing that little bit more range, as you say. And you could go into the physiology of it, but you're just trying to shift everything, aren't you? Like you say, you're just opening it up. You're trying to shift everything along. But also, if you've got a limited VO2 max and you're trying to operate at a higher end of that VO2 max, then you're not going to be able to operate at it, or you're going to limit your capacity to be able to operate at that top end level. So if you can raise that ceiling a little bit, you can operate at it for maybe a little bit longer, or you can certainly operate at it at a higher level. So there's loads of like scientific stuff behind it as well, but I like the way you put it, like very, very simply. Look, we're just trying to push those ranges a little bit.
Well, I mean, the nice thing for me is that's what I needed. I needed that speed work. And a lot of people I coach are very similar. They come from a sort of a marathon type, entry into the sport. So I always try and get them to do, especially in the summer, some 5K work just to build on that. And even in their marathon block, just keep up that VO2 work. And, I had an athlete recently over the last, couple of years, and he initially wanted to ultimately run 2:54 for the marathon. It was like his stepdad, or not stepdad, his father-in-law's marathon PB was like 2:54. So he wanted the family PB, and he'd been out of sport for a while, and he sort of came to me wanting to break 3 hours, and I was like, you can definitely break 3 hours, based on what you can do for a half marathon. You can break 3 hours, but we'll get you to do some speed work first and just see where that goes. And over the months, I could see from his speed work, he had much more speed in him. He was, and I think he will be capable, hopefully this year, of going below 250, and he did run 250, 254 in Chicago, and progressed nicely through the race. And it's just, keeping up that VO2 work in the marathon block specifically is crucial to some people, because without it, your marathon pace feels very, very hard quickly.
Yeah, I think it's a really good word you use as well. Like, it's really important to some people. Like, everybody's different, aren't they? But some people just need it in there all the time,
Yeah,
and they need to not stay too far away from it because, yes, it's about sustaining a slower pace over a longer period of time. But if you've not made that pace feel a bit easier than it should, it's soon going to bite. If you're feeling right on the end of that pace right from the get go, it's going to be a tough old run in for 26.2 miles.
yeah, it's exactly what you said earlier. It's it's I think people don't really understand what they need to do to be quicker, and I certainly didn't 20 odd years ago. And they they think to run, let's say, under 3 hours, they just need to do more at that marathon pace, and that's not necessarily the case. As you say, like, everybody's different, and there is some examples. I've had people who are predominantly 1500 5k runners go to the marathon, and they need that marathon work,
Yeah.
definitely. But most people, yeah, they just need to work on a bit of speed and a bit of threshold stuff, and they don't really need to touch too much marathon stuff in the build up. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you get two types of people, which you've just identified, and I think depending on what kind of range they're at for their ability level. But what I tend to see is, let's say I'm going to take somebody who's aiming between 4 and 5 hours. Um, I almost see the opposite with those runners. They think they're not fast enough, so they come at it where they think I need more speed, more speed, more speed, and they've neglected the longer work. But if you look at it like physiologically, for them, they're going to be out for say 4.5, 5 hours. Well, that's like training for an ultra compared to somebody who's training for a 3 hour marathon. There's a big difference between 3 hours and 5 hours. It's two
Mm,
hours extra out there. So like that speed work becomes a little bit less important, but they almost put more of an emphasis on it, and that's where they make that mistake. But then you're absolutely spot on. I see it so many times where the guys who hover up, so certainly some of the ladies and the fellas who I've coached do around 3 hours, they just think, right, I need more marathon stuff, more marathon stuff. But
yeah.
often they're quite good at that type of stuff naturally, but their
Mm,
top end is missing. And you hit the nail on the head. It's because they don't know what to do. They don't
yeah.
know how to train it, and their sessions are often not the best structured to improve that speed. So let's give our listeners a bit of a taste of what do some of those sessions look like then. So again, putting your coaching hat on here, what are some of your classic sessions where you'd look to develop that VO2 or maybe a bit faster work in there? Some of your favorites?
Well, I suppose it changes, right? But let's just say if I want them to focus on 5 and 10k for the summer, um, typically we'll do a lot of the staple sessions me and you would have done. 5 6 by k off 3 minutes.
Yeah.
But I find that it's also takes people a while to get there. We used to do that almost every month because we'd done it for years.
Mm.
Um,
That's a good
so
point.
I typically probably start people off with, probably like 600s, something like, I don't know, probably 8 by 600. Then might move to 6 by 800 and 7 by 800, and then maybe towards 5 by k, 6 by k. Um, so those type of sessions. But I I also love monofartlek as a simple speed type session.
Nice.
Um, Also, it does lend itself to some of the more endurance based athletes because, especially after they've done it the first time, me included, you see it as a 20-minute set. And for people who don't know monofartlek, it's 2 by 90 seconds, 4 by a minute, 4 by 30 seconds, 4 by 15 seconds of equal recovery, but you keep the recovery at a steady type flow effort. And me included, you do the 90 seconds really hard, float quite hard early on, and you get to that sort of third and fourth minute and into the 30 seconds, and they're the most painful things on earth. So I like to think that teaches some of the endurance athletes to respect the speed a little bit, to then hit those, eventually be able to hit those 30-15 seconds quite hard. But yeah, I like that. And the other session I like to give people, I think, is something like, and it depends, for somebody who's a little bit quicker, it would be 2K, 1600, 1200, 800, 400
Nice.
of sizable recoveries. For other people who are maybe closer to sort of 20 minutes 5K, that might be something like 1600, a K, 800, 600, 400, something, something altered. But yeah, there's the odd occasion where I give somebody, a really intense, what I would say is an intense speed session, like something like 2 by a K, 3 by 600, 2 by 400 or something like that. But most of my athletes, I don't take that far down into sort of 15. I don't take them to sort of 1500 and 3K work that often. If they're doing out and out speed, it's usually at the end of the session. So I might tag on 4 by 200 at the end as fast as they can, just to do a little bit of pure speed work. But yeah, I mean, compared to you, I'm still more at the endurance side of VO2, I would say. But yeah, and then into the marathon block, I like to keep sort of the kilometer reps going, so probably more towards 8 by a kilometer off 90 seconds or 6 by a mile off anywhere between 60 and 90 seconds, depending on where they're at in the training. And the other session I think I quite like is the Michigan. Did we speak about this?
I've not spoken to you about it, but I know the session well. I've done it myself over time. I set it very rarely for people, but I do set it. Yeah, it's a great session.
I like to set it in like the early part of the marathon block, for just to keep a little bit of speed, but also keep a bit of threshold running in there. I do it as 2K tempo reps in between. I think
interesting.
A mile.
Yeah.
Because I think the actual loop around the Michigan track is closer to 2K if you were actually
right. Okay. Yeah.
And then so what's it? 1600, 1200, 800, 400.
Yeah, with a threshold in between.
Separated by some threshold reps, but you do have recovery in between. But it's quite a big volume session, and I have played around with it to add an extra threshold rep at the start and add a bit of volume. But yeah, I mean, there's so many ways you can, as my coach Nick would say, skin a tiger, and it's just playing around with it. And I suppose ultimately, with those sessions over that sort of period of the summer, you're trying to build them up to sort of handle that race pace, that 5K race pace. So you might, as you say, start with 600s at 5K race pace, but eventually build it up to, 4 by a mile at race pace. And that should give them the confidence. If they're doing 4 by a mile at race pace off 2-3 minutes recovery, well, you should be able to then do that in a 5K. And as I tell my athletes, I did 4 by a mile 2 weeks before I ran my 5K PB, and I averaged 4:37, I think. But I then raced at 4:32, so you can still go quicker in a race environment.
Funnily enough, I did that exact session, 4 by a mile off 2.5 minutes. I think about 10 days out. Yeah, exactly that. Or put the spikes on for the last rep. The old spikes, couldn't do it all in the old spikes, but yeah, that was my session 10 days out for my 5K PB. And similar to you, I think I averaged, I can't remember what I averaged, but I went about 2 or 3 seconds quicker on the night than my average in that session. So almost identical. I'm going to touch on a couple of things you said there, because I think it's really interesting. The first thing, like, people might listen and think, oh, well, doing 400, 600s, they're not like out and out VO2 max work, because you need to be running longer than that. But you're absolutely spot on. You can't just throw people in straight at 3-4 minute reps and get that hit. And I do almost identical to you, where I almost build them up, build that tolerance up to be able to then get the most out of that work over, say, K reps, or like the guys on the track last night I had down, we're doing 1200 reps on the track, which I know is going to be closer to 4 minutes. So That's a good distance as well. And then you mentioned about, well, you mentioned a lot of sessions, and what I love about it is variety. So like you mentioned the Michigan, you mentioned the fartlek, you mentioned interval sessions, you mentioned speed, you mentioned cut down sessions. And I do think, like, especially the people that we coach online, because they're not with a group all the time, they do like that novelty factor of having
Yeah,
something different, that change of stimulus. I do think that's important. Do you see the same thing where people respond to that, having something
yeah,
different in there?
yeah. And I sometimes struggle with that a little bit because probably like you, we're used to this almost boring type summer of work
Absolutely.
where
Yeah.
know the
Yeah.
staple sessions, they're going to be repeated. Um, so it's sometimes quite hard to vary it up every single week. But yeah, exactly that. That's what people like, and they respond better to that sort of switch and stimulus, I think. And and I think everybody does respond well to a range of sessions. And the other session I didn't mention, which I do quite like, is is something like 8 by 3 minutes or 8 by 1K, where you're doing, and this is building people up into those quicker sessions. You do the odd reps at 5K pace, and then the even reps at threshold. You still have your sort of minute, 90 seconds recovery. But I think that allows people to at least get 4 by 3 minutes at 5K pace first, but
Yeah.
still with a bigger volume of session. Um, and I do often use that to sort of, once we get into the marathon block, I'll move that to maybe 12 by K on off, not on off, but odds at 5K evens at threshold, and then transition into the marathon type sessions where you're doing on off type work. But they're then used to, they've
Yeah.
sort of done a variation of that before. So, again, you can't throw 16K of K on off at somebody who's never done it before. It's just too hard a session. So I'm sure we'll
Yeah.
come on to those in a second.
No, it's a really good point, and like you say, those big on-off sessions that become a big part of people's marathon training at any standard, where they're dipping in and out of paces and maybe throwing some pace variants in. Even to people who are sat here listening, thinking, "Well, I'm gonna run walk a marathon. I'm gonna do like a Jeffing strategy." It's the same thing. You're going to be dipping in and out of paces, and you certainly can be doing that in training as well. One thing that I wanted to touch on around that, because I think this is like a perfect session where, for me as a coach, I look at it and think, right, well, I'm getting a really good like physiological stimulus because they're getting some like threshold benefit or, VO2 max benefit, whatever that physiological benefit is from that specific session. But what they're also getting is almost like a double benefit, because I feel like what it gets them really good at is they become intuitive to their pacing and listening to their body. So I'm
Yeah,
almost getting like double bang for my buck, because I know that they're going to benefit from judging the pacing, which will help them with the marathon. But they're also getting a physiological benefit, which is why I love those sessions. And I think it's really important for marathon runners to know how it feels, because when you get to marathon day, it can feel so easy to start with. And then later on, that perception of effort's being just totally out because of the adrenaline, the crowds, and all those type of thing. So in training, I think it is good for that. And I'm sure you found it when you were training for the marathon that they
yeah.
massively helped you.
Well, I mean, it's nice that you're similar to me. I mean, both those points are spot on in that. I I see a lot of recreational type runners. You give them a session and they want to know like specific paces, and I kind of give people often a range. And look, me and you would have had sessions where you've got kind of roughly goal type paces,
Yeah.
but more most of the times for me they were sort of more self-imposed, unless it was a really specific sort of tune-up session where you're like, right, I need to hit 66s or whatever it may be, or 64s. You, um, I would always go, well, I don't know, I've got Ks at 5K pace, so I'm going to run them at 5K intensity, and just I built that up over years of knowing what that was, and I think I still do it now, and I do laps of my cricket pitch, which people laugh at because that's the closest I've got to a track. I can guarantee on every session I do, if I've got 10 reps of um, say a K, they will be within a 2-3 second range. Like the slowest will be 3 seconds off the fastest. It's you sort of learn this pace judgment, and that's only learned from listening to your body. You can't
Yeah.
learn that off somebody saying you go out and run 68. It just doesn't work that way. So I like to try where I can to give athletes. Well, I want you to do 2K at threshold. I want you to do the miles at 10K type pace and the 1200s at 5K type pace, and sort of get them to learn what that feels like. Because as you're right, the key to the marathon, I think, is discipline and learning to be disciplined, and that's again only learned through experiences in training.
Yeah.
And those, when you get to those longer sessions in your marathon block, teaching yourself to be disciplined is almost more important than teaching yourself to run marathon pace. You've got to be you've got to hold back, because as you say, you get to the marathon race day, and if you're not feeling good at 25-30K, you've gone too hard and you've not been disciplined enough. And that comes from people who are focusing more on, I need to run this set pace, instead of listening or even I mean, as more experienced type runners, I tend to be able to race things better than actually follow my watch.
Yeah.
I'd rather sort of run with a group and race the people around me, and I can sort of feel my way into a race better from that than sort of going, right, I need to run 5:15 this mile, next mile, oh, that was a 5:16, I need to pick up by a second. It doesn't work. I don't think it works like that.
No, it's practice as well, isn't it? It's not being afraid to fail. Firstly, I think people are so worried about failing in sessions, like, oh, I'm not going to hit these splits and my coach is going to see it and they're going to think I'm rubbish. Like, it doesn't work like that. You're going to fail, so don't be afraid to fail. But also, we grew up in a generation where maybe for the first 5, 6, 7, maybe even 8 years, we didn't have watches that gave us splits all the time. So I do believe we were in a generation where we got good at it. Whereas now, even from the elites down to people who are getting into the sport for the very first time, they are getting technology on their wrist and the pace is visible now from the very first run. So it's almost like they've become reliant on it. But I agree with you. I go onto the trails now and I'll tell myself, like my last race, I knew I was going to be out for around about 2 hours 45. So I'm like, right, well, 2 hours 45, that's like marathon effort. And I'm checking in with myself, like when I'm on a hill and I'm going, right, this is quite intense now. I'm climbing a hill. Quick check in. You're an hour in. Can you manage an effort similar to this for another hour and a half? And I'm like checking in, and then I go back to focusing on the present. But it does require discipline because I see so many people going off, and I'm thinking there's no way you can hold that pace for 3 hours because you wouldn't be able to hold it on a road, let alone a trail. But that comes down to what you're describing. We're very similar here. Intuition, racing practice, but it has to be learned, and you have to accept that you are going to fail at times. But if you don't practice it in training without your watch, you'll never get good at it. You've got to practice it, haven't you?
And just going back to your point on failing in training, I think what we see, we're a bit, we're spoiled. We're blessed in a way that we get to see everybody's training on Strava. We get to see what the elites are doing, but it's also a bad thing in that it almost looks like every run that somebody does is perfect. And I'm coached by an Australian guy now, and I was listening to their podcast, which is Inside Running Podcast, which if people want to learn a bit about marathon training, it's a good resource because they get lots of top guests on, and they're good marathon runners themselves, and coaches, so they can speak about it well. But he one of the guys was saying he had 3 by 15 minutes, kind of a staple early type marathon workout or half marathon type session. And on paper, it looks like he nailed it. But when he spoke about it, he went far too hard, felt like he was running far too hard, and didn't get the sort of stimulus that he wanted from the session, and almost got a negative type reaction. But everybody else was looking at it thinking, he's in shape here, he's nailed that.
Yeah, interesting.
And I look back at my marathon PB block, and 6 weeks out from my PB, I was going to do 25k marathon pace tempo on the
Right.
road. And that was, I was actually going to go a little bit slower than marathon pace. So my goal marathon pace was 5:10. I thought I'll start out at 5:15s and work my way into it. And I had Josh Lunn on the bike in front of me, and from mine, I run out into the fens. So you get a bit down, you get a few sort of lumps in the first few miles, but then it's absolutely dead flat, like no elevation so you can go out 20 miles. So I get sort of 5-6 miles into this. I've just swapped between miles and Ks. I get about 10k into this run at pace, and I'm sort of clicking along at 5:18s, and I'm like, this feels awful.
Yeah.
And I call it a day at 8 mile. Sort of had that, like most of us do, had a word for myself, jogged for a K, and thought, I'll go again. Did another 3k and was like, no, this is dreadful. So, I ran a combination of 9-10 miles at sort of 5:18 pace, feeling dreadful, and called it a day. 6 weeks later, I ran 5:12 to the marathon. Felt feeling much, much better. So we can all have bad days. It's fine.
100%.
You need to have bad days to learn those bad experiences. Because if you haven't done those marathon sessions where you've hurt and failed, I would say you're not going to be prepared for that last 10k of a marathon where it does hurt and you need to fight those demons.
And it's one of those things as well, isn't it, where within that session you might be carrying a bit of residue fatigue from the week. It might just be that you're a little bit run down, but ultimately you've got to know your body, and putting yourself in a hole on that day wasn't the right answer. Like, to keep battering yourself to try and hit splits that you can't hit and ruining the next sort of 4 to 5 weeks, which we'll go on to now because it's a really nice way to go into it. But we talk a lot about, like, specifically that last 8 weeks being a crucial block. Like, you were right in the middle of that block, and that block could have been ruined at that point in time if you'd have absolutely buried yourself, because it could have taken you days, if not a week, to recover. You may never have recovered from it if you'd have gone too hard. And yeah, I want to chat to you a little bit about that block, because I know you put a big emphasis on it, and we do as coaches. And I feel like a lot of people out there get this last block wrong when it comes to marathon. They've teed it up, they've done a lot of good work, but then I see it as a really specific phase. And if I'm honest, I don't think a lot of people who don't have coaching support don't go specific enough in that phase, and they avoid kind of the longer stuff where it gets specific. What are your thoughts on that, Aaron, as a runner yourself and as a coach?
Well, I'll start with, I got it wrong too. Like, my first few marathons, there wasn't, Strava wasn't a thing. There wasn't that much information going around on the internet. There was the Let's Run forums, and you could sort of see what certain people were doing. But you could only probably see what, Canova was doing with Moses, whatever his name was, which wasn't really relevant to what, I was trying to do as a debut marathoner. And my coach then, Mark, wasn't a marathon coach. He'd coached a lot of sort of 5k type guys. So it was a learning for us. And I don't feel we got it right. And we placed too much emphasis on just doing long, easy type runs, and didn't do enough marathon pace and didn't do enough threshold type running either. I don't think we did a lot of track sessions with the group and then sort of a long run.
Long, easy runs, time on feet, as they used to say.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I suppose I was a little bit different in that I was so interested in the science of marathon running, and I spoke to a lot of people. I spoke to a lot of guys from the 80s. I sort of emailed them and tried to get any information I could out of them, and I got various insights, but it was always a little bit difficult because they didn't have GPS, so they weren't really ever sure on how fast or how slow they were running or whatever. So I met Nick Anderson through Saucony, who I was supported by for a while, and Nick was a coach for them, and he'd had experience with Andy Vernon over the shorter distances, but he'd also coached Ben Moreau to 250 for the marathon. Martin Williams, who was, I think, around 218 and got into the Commonwealth team for Scotland. So I needed somebody who'd coached, and I wanted to learn off somebody who could tell me kind of what they had done and his approach. And I think a lot of my sessions are based on a lot of his. And in that specific period, he liked, and I liked, to get people to break up the long runs into blocks of marathon pace. And a lot of my athletes will see the same sessions over and over again when they go through the marathon blocks. They're, 10k, 6k, 4k off sizable k jogs, but you're getting 18 to 21 miles done with sort of 12 miles of marathon effort in there, but they're not overly intense. So look, they're more intense than a slow, easy run, but they're not as intense as I've seen. And I was speaking to Jeffro, one of our coaches, about this the other day, and what I feel like people are getting wrong now is they're seeing what the likes of Phil Sessman, Ben Connor, or even some of the international athletes are doing. And they're doing a lot of marathon pace or quicker, followed up with floats that are, in some cases, 20 seconds per K slower than their threshold. And they're doing these I think Callum Hawkins was the first, these monster sessions, which are going to burn people out.
Too hard.
And let's be honest, they burn a lot of those people I just mentioned out as well. I never did that. I did, and I was saying this to Jeffro, I did. So let's just say on that specific 10k, 6k, 4k session, I do the 10k at sort of marathon effort, and that might not be goal marathon pace. That would be marathon effort on the day, because I'd be in a big volume week, so that might be slower. It might be 5:20s on that given day. So I do it at marathon effort. I then do the 6k probably at goal marathon effort, and then I do the 4k maybe at half marathon effort. So I might go a little bit quicker than marathon pace, but if I'm not feeling good, I just keep it all the same.
Yeah.
And in between, we were doing sometimes 5k jog at, I say jog, 5k steady, probably a minute to a minute 15 per mile slower than marathon pace.
Yeah.
So a lot slower than what people are doing them now. And I therefore found that I could keep the volume in the week much higher. And I was always quite a big volume type runner. I was doing 120, 130 mile weeks. But in that specific phase, and I would always call that specific phase 9 weeks out to 2 weeks out, let's say. So that 7-week phase, I would swap. I would have been doing sessions Tuesday, Friday with a long run, maybe a little bit quick on a Sunday. I'd swap to Wednesday session, Saturday or Sunday marathon session, and that would be it. So I'd just do 2 sessions a week in that period, but keep the volume high for me, which is all relative to people. So I felt like I didn't need to go that intense. And you look at those blocked sessions, and it was very rare that I did over half marathon as marathon pace, which to some people would seem like you're not doing much, but it always worked for me. And I've done that with quite a few of my athletes, and it's always worked pretty well for them. And it only starts to go wrong when they push those sessions.
Pushing too hard.
I give them, let's just use the 10k, 6k, 4k, and then end up running the 10k at almost sort of half marathon effort. Or the other good one is 2 by 10k off 3 to 5k jog, and they do the 10ks at much quicker than marathon pace, and we just burn them out. again, and they wouldn't be able to recover for the Wednesday session, and then they'd feel tired and not get the response from Wednesday and so on.
And
I realised I've
that's the
waffled on
key.
for a while.
No, it's really good. That's the key to it, isn't it? And I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. It's the cost of that run on the rest of the program when you're trying to complete a program and not just one session. I think that's what people become focused on. They think, I need to crush this long run because this is the key session. Well, no, it's the key block. Everything's got to be done properly, and comes back to patient and discipline, that word you use right at the start. You've got to be disciplined with it. But the other thing for me is like understanding the physiological demands as well. Like, can you run? So we're saying, roughly speaking, people say tempo is a pace you can sustain for an hour, no matter kind of, what level you are. That's what the physiologists say. So for anybody, if you just look at it that way, right, tempo should be around about something I can sustain for an hour. If you're not as well trained, maybe close to 45 minutes. So if you're trying to run tempo sections within that long run, and you're going faster than that for 10K blocks, like, you can't do that physiologically speaking. That's going to damage you. So you're going too hard. Whereas you could sustain marathon pace, because that falls more between, for a lot of people, tempo and steady. But this is where you get, and I've had this a lot, and I tried to explain it to people, when people who, they easy run too fast, and they get really caught out when eventually you get to these big long runs. Because let's say somebody easy runs a 9-minute mile in and they're wanting to break 4 hours for the marathon. Well, that 9-minute mile in is all of a sudden faster than their marathon pace. So when we come to do these big long runs, all of a sudden their long runs are inside a marathon pace for the whole blooming distance. Yeah. And this is where you've got to go back to a point you've already made, Aaron, is like, understand those paces, understand your body, but also understand the purpose behind it, and be controlled and disciplined with it. Because I think it's really important, that block, the 9 to 7. You mentioned that 7-week window, the last 2 weeks being the taper, of course, but that is a crucial part, isn't it? But a lot of people do get it wrong and often overcook it.
Well, yeah, I'll just go back to a couple of examples. I think it's therefore important you have a coach, because I remember in one of my blocks, I had 4x4K off 2K steady as a session, and I went out to the track to do it, and I had hay fever quite badly. It was sort of early September or late August maybe. I was probably training for an early autumn marathon, and I actually misjudged the first 4K block. So I somehow so I think I wanted to run around about 78 seconds per lap. So in my head, I was like, that's 3 seconds per lap slower than 5-minute miling, 75.
Yeah, 75, yeah.
But somehow in my head, I changed that to 3 seconds slower than 70 seconds. So I ran the first sort of, I think the first mile at 73s. And then it was only coming into 2K, I was like, this is miles too fast. And I wasn't feeling good anyway. So I used my judgment again to call it after a rep and a half, and text my coach, and he was like, again, you've made the right call to shut it down. We'll go again tomorrow. And I actually went again tomorrow and completed the session on the road, no problems, bang on pace. So you want to be able to build your athletes up to be able to make those good decisions themselves. I think half coaching is building people to a level that they can almost start to make those decisions for themselves. That's what we need. So you need to be able to, call things if they aren't going right. But you also need a coach to feed back to straight away and say, look, this didn't go. Not be scared to say, look, this didn't go well. What do you think? And that coach might say, you need a couple of days off, and which my coach used to do now and again. Like, look, just take 2 days completely off and we'll reset. Because none of us want to do that as athletes. We all want to push through.
Absolutely.
You need that sounding board to. So I'd say to people, don't be scared to. Your coach is never going to see it as we don't look at people's sessions and go, oh, they've failed. They've not hit what we wanted them to. We'd much rather have that honest conversation of why maybe it's not felt right, and how we can get them to feel right in the next week, 2 weeks. And and not dig themselves into this massive hole. So I think that's important in just that coach-athlete relationship is the coach is never going to be disappointed. And I know I used to be in the same situation. You feel like you let people down, but you're not letting anybody down by having a bad race or a bad session. We just want you to be happy, isn't it? That's what we want. We want you to be happy with your own performances. And then when it comes to marathon pace, and paces as a general thing, as I've probably shown you, I've got these algorithms. I'm into data, so I'm into these percentages of marathon pace. And I truly think somebody who's well trained can almost get to 94-95% of, and I realise I'm getting technical now, 94-95% of threshold as their marathon pace. But that doesn't mean to say everybody can start there.
No.
So in the early part of the marathon phase, I will probably start with their marathon pace being 90-92% of threshold. And seeing how they react to that, seeing if they can stay disciplined at that, and I'll slowly eke it up, and we might get closer to some people 93-94% of threshold. And I was actually listening to Dan Nash on a podcast the other day, who's a Welsh marathon runner. He's run 2:15, and if you look at his last 8 performances, he's negative split them all. And he's a physiologist. He goes into the lab the week of the race, works out where his threshold is, and I think he also works the 94-95% of threshold being his marathon pace. But then he goes much more into it, and he sets heart rate targets over the 5K, but that's for another day. But then in terms of your rest of your paces, I will always, let's just use my sort of, because they're quite round numbers. If I say my threshold is 5-minute miling, my recovery running would be 7 to 7:30 pace. That's what I used to do as my sort of 5-6 mile, 8 mile hour type recovery runs. They'd be around between 7 and 7:30s. Some mornings close to 7:30, some mornings maybe slightly under 7s. But that's 2 minutes per mile slower than threshold. So 1:45 slower than marathon pace. And trying to get some of my athletes to do even a minute per mile slower than marathon pace for their recovery runs is a struggle. So half my battle in the first sort of 3-6 months of coaching people is slowing them down on recovery days. Trying to get people to run 8-9 minute miling. Because all I see is people who are racing at 6-minute mile for the marathon, so 2:37, but doing all their jogs at sort of 6:45 to 7s. I'm like, you're not recovering, and recovery, that's where you make all your benefits. There's no point doing those hard sessions if you can't recover from them. And so I'm big into recovery running, and obviously sleep and nutrition and all those things are absolutely vital, which me having a newborn, you realize even more. Like I did a session yesterday, and as I said to you before the podcast, I sort of slept on the sofa till 4 a.m, then got sort of 3 hours solid between 4 and 7. My run I jumped on the treadmill because I just couldn't face even trying to run that slow on the road, because my legs did not want to run this morning. So respect recovery, and you'll be a better runner for it. And don't be afraid to go as slow as your body needs. And
And I think
just need to, just jog slower.
I think that's a great message to kind of leave people with, because one thing we see a lot is people running too fast and almost feeling like they need to prove themselves in every single run. But as you quite rightly say, rest is so important. The Magnus equation, the Magnus and Brad Stolberg equation, is stress plus rest equals growth. I think it's a really good little equation. I know you like your complicated data, but that's a simple one, and it's very simple. But if you take anything out of that equation, If you take the rest out of it and you just keep stressing yourself, you won't get the adaptations you need. You won't get the growth you need. But likewise, back to the harder long runs, if you just keep resting and doing everything easy and you don't put any stress in there as well, you also won't get the growth. So it's a really good point to kind of wrap things up on. I guess I always ask, Aaron, is there one kind of final message you want to leave with people? I know you're very much marathon focused with your coach, certainly endurance focused. And I love that because that's where you specialize as a runner and that's how you specializing with your coaching. Any last top tips for people?
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, as you just said, like what I was talking about in, percentages of threshold, I don't really tell that to an athlete. If they want to know, if they want to learn, and I sometimes do explain it, on calls, this is why we're doing it this type of pace, to give them that knowledge. But the tip is to keep it simple, to not overcomplicate anything.
Yeah.
And I think as soon as you start overcomplicating sessions or focusing too much on specific paces for recovery runs, and it becomes a bit overwhelming. Like if you keep it simple and just focus, as you said, focus on recovery, focus on that growth as yourself as an athlete, and don't put too much stress on it, then that's where you're going to succeed. And I think look, it's difficult for people because I understand that there's stress. People get nervous about sessions, people get nervous about races, but as my top tip, what all my athletes would have heard is, honestly, outside of you as an athlete and the coach, nobody cares what time you run. When it comes to marathon race day, my wife, who, we've been together the best part of, I'm going to get this wrong now, probably about 16 years.
Pressure's on.
Probably more, but yeah, I think it is 16 years because a 6-year marriage anniversary the other day. But she still doesn't know what time I've run for the marathon. She'll go up if somebody asks her, she'll say, I don't know. Sometimes she might say like 2:08, and I'm like, yeah, that's not what I've run. But
yeah, I wish.
Nobody remembers and nobody cares the following day. And you still, whether you run, if you're targeting 2:59 and run 3:05, you go home, your wife's still going to like you, your kids are going to like you, your cat's still going to like you. It's all fine. Like, don't worry about it. And as soon as you start overstressing is when you have bad performances. And I don't know if you know Matt O'Dowd from Your Luck for a Day.
No, I used to work with him, yeah.
He was the one who gave me that tip. I stood on the start of national cross country with him, and we were sort of running around the same sort of paces in those days. He was slowing down a bit, I was getting a bit quicker. And he was like, you look a bit nervous, mate. And I was like, yeah, I'd really like to run well today. And he's like, literally smile and enjoy it and you'll run well. And I did. I just relaxed, just enjoyed the whole, and I've never had a race like it where I've just sort of floated throughout the whole run because I was just trying to enjoy it. And same as my marathon PB. I remember on that, I think I got to about 28k, and there was a couple of kids on the side of the road in Frankfurt, and it's quite open, and they started racing me. And I started chatting to this sort of 8-year-old and high-fived him, and I sort of snapped back into it. I was like, I'm at 29k in a marathon here. I'm messing around with this. And I think if you're relaxed like that, you get the most out of it. So yeah, try not to stress. In that race week, get everything sorted well in advance. So on race day, you just need to put one foot in front of the other and execute, because all your training will come to fruition if you're relaxed and enjoy it. So yeah, for me, running's a simple thing. Look, it's also at the same time majorly complicated, but let's keep it simple. Let's enjoy it, because that's what we're all here for. We're here to enjoy it. We're not here to stress over seconds or minutes. So yeah.
Nice messages to leave. I'm going to round up with those 2 points. So I heard a coach recently, coach and commentator, actually say, they call it KISS, keep it simple, stupid. Like, we all become a bit stupid at times and try to overcomplicate it. And it's a very simple sport. If you run and you continue to run, you will get fitter. Like, it is sometimes that simple, and we do overcomplicate putting one foot in front of the other. But the other thing, relax, smile, and enjoy it. I think that's a great message for people to take away. Happy runners are generally very good runners, and I see a positive correlation in that with my coaching. I'm sure you do as well. We often see it across the board here at New Levels Coaching that people who are happy and enjoying themselves are generally running pretty well, and they go hand in hand. So yeah, two nice messages.
Keeping life in balance. It's, all your life things in balance is when you are the most relaxed, the most happy. So
definitely,
so don't neglect. If you like a bit of chocolate in the evening, eat chocolate in the evening. It's not going to make. It's good. You're going to make more negatives by starving yourself from something like that. So yeah, keep everything in balance. I think Paula said the same, didn't she?
Keep it in moderation. Yeah, keep it in moderation. Yeah, and lots of similar messages there from Paula's podcast, which is one of the podcasts we've done on the marathon, particularly when she was chasing the world record. But that was nice to get another perspective, Aaron. So thank you for sharing that with a coach's hat on as well. It's been really good to chat through that. If you'd like to find out more about coaching with New Levels Coaching or with Aaron in general, then obviously reach out to us. We do a free discovery call if you'd like to chat about coaching. A lot of people sit there and think coaching isn't right for me, but if you're looking to improve, if you're looking to be better, it's not just for elite athletes, for runners of all abilities who just want to be that little bit better. And I think Aaron put it quite nicely where he said just having that accountability of someone to talk to so that you can take the pressure off yourself and enjoy your running, then that's who coaching's for. So if you want to reach out, then please do. You can head over to our website and you can book a call with us and we can chat that through. But Aaron, thank you very much. Thanks for giving up your time. It's a busy man and a busy life, and taking time out of family life as well to join us. So I really appreciate that. And do you know what? I think, being the endurance man, you've just set the endurance record for the longest podcast.
Doesn't surprise me. That's what we did every week on my podcast. Went too long.
Well, it's a good thing when you're an endurance runner. But no, absolute pleasure, mate. Really appreciate it, and I hope everyone's enjoyed it. We'll see you all again very soon, and in the meantime, enjoy your racing and enjoy your training. Cheers, guys. Perfect.